Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending upon when and where you are watching this. I salute you. Today, we're going to be talking about colonialism. And when you start talking about European colonialism in the American hemisphere, there's many different countries that we could speak about. We could talk about the Dutch settlement of what became the New Netherlands and ultimately became places like New York and New Jersey. We could talk about the French in the southern region of what is now Canada. You've got the Spanish who have colonized a whole range of different places, including California. At least by 1769 they will do so. But because the heritage of the United States is English, we're going to focus this week predominantly on the experiences of the English colonists. Now, as you may be aware of, eventually there will be 13 original colonies settled around 3 different regions. We break these regions up into the southern region, the Chesapeake area, and these would include things like Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia. In fact, Jamestown is the very first permanent and successful English colony, founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company. You've got the New England colonies, settled largely by Puritans and the Pilgrims who came in search of religious freedom. And then you've got a range of folks who settled a number of colonies in what became known as the middle colonies. Pennsylvania, New York would be examples of these middle colonies. And so we're going to talk briefly about some of the experiences that the English had in some of these colonies. We're not going to get to all of them. But there is an idea or concept that I want you to be aware of, and this is something that we call settler colonialism. And there are different types of colonial experiences, but settler colonialism is the form of colonialism that the English undertook. And settler colonialism is basically this idea that when you arrived on the land, it was your assumption, it was your belief, that is, Europeans came to the Americas, and it was their belief that the land intrinsically belonged to them, and oftentimes they would claim the right to the land by this idea known as the right of discovery, that it was a new world, quote unquote, and therefore as a new world, as a frontier that was untamed and uncivilized, basically their idea is that they came, they discovered this new world, and they were going to settle it, and they were going to take the land, and they themselves would be able to occupy it and, in fact, own the land. Now, this is somewhat problematic given the fact that Native Americans already resided on this land, but you need to understand a big difference between the way in which Native Americans understood land ownership and the way in which Europeans understood it. Native Americans looked upon the land as being something to be used in common. That is, everyone had access to the land. Now, this didn't mean that folks didn't have particular parcels of land that they lived upon. It's just the idea of one owning the land was kind of a foreign idea to them. One didn't simply sanction off a portion of property and call it their own, and therefore you can't have access to it. They lived in community. They lived in common with the land. By contrast, Europeans saw land ownership vastly different. And when the Europeans arrived, the way in which Native Americans were using the land, that is in common, didn't match up with their definition of land ownership, which basically had a lot to do with you settle a piece of property, you sanction it off, and property is owned because of one's production off the land. So you might grow some commodities on the land, you've settled a house, you've improved the land in some way. And because Native peoples didn't necessarily do that with the land, Europeans, when they arrived, they didn't think that Native peoples actually owned the territory, and so therefore they took it. And land ownership and land acquisition was central to the settler colonial experience. Another aspect which is very central to the settler colonial experience is the fact that Native peoples needed to be removed from the property that Europeans found them upon. And oftentimes this took very violent forms. Some scholars have gone so far as to argue that what happened to Native peoples was in fact an act of genocide. There are those who argue against that because, of course, genocide has to have a strong sense of intent. And one of the things that we know is that Native peoples largely were killed due to diseases. Now, there's definitely episodes where Europeans deliberately gave Native Americans disease-infested smallpox blankets, for example. For the most part, Europeans didn't necessarily come over to the Americas with the intent of spreading diseases. They recognized that that was happening and didn't necessarily change their course of action, but that wasn't necessarily their intent. But my point is this: Native peoples were not necessarily part of the settler colonial mind frame. The idea under settler colonialism is that you will come, the Europeans will come, they will settle the land, they will occupy the land, they will come to own the land, and then they will spread their institutions, that is, their religion, their churches, their education, their political ideologies and institutions across the land. And that's ultimately what will happen for the United States. And unfortunately, in the process, the settler colonial process, which is a structure, it's not a historical event, it's something that took a long time. In the end, as the settler colonial experience basically unravels itself and expands, and you begin to see the Americas become dominated by the United States, Native peoples will be so successfully marginalized, not only as people groups, as they're removed from their reservations and they're wiped off the planet effectively. You know, we talked about California Indians before, but by 1900, there was only about 30,000 native California Indians left. Most of them had either been wiped out by disease or, as happened in California, they were systematically murdered. I think genocide is an appropriate term to be used for the experience of California Indians. But Native peoples have also been marginalized in many historical records. They just aren't talked about. They aren't mentioned. It's as if they never were there. And so I think it's important for us to recognize this tension that exists between Europeans' point of view and the reality that Native Americans lived on the land. And not just Native peoples, but you're also going to have a whole range of others, including Mexicans. And as we get later into this course, you'll see that the experience that Mexicans had with the coming of the Americas, coming to the United States, will be in some ways equally desperate. But please be aware of this notion of settler colonialism. It is central to the experience that Europeans had. Now, like I said, we're going to be talking about a number of different colonies. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Jamestown Colony, founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company. Understand that when the Virginia Company came and settled Jamestown, they did not come for religious freedom. They came almost as what we might today call venture capitalists. A joint stock company is basically the equivalent of the modern day corporation. A bunch of wealthy men, and I say a bunch, about 100 wealthy men who had no experience farming, who had no idea what they were doing as far as creating a farming agricultural community. They came to the Americas with the intent on making money. They thought they were going to find gold. They in fact did not find gold, and the Jamestown colony is actually going to struggle immensely because those who settled the region were predominantly men. They didn't bring their families with them necessarily, so there was a paucity of women in the region. And as you may be aware, families are a stabilizing institution, and they simply didn't exist in any significant amount there. And these men didn't necessarily want to work, and so they're left to their own devices. They're left to an ignorance about the land, and as a result, they are actually quite dependent upon the native Powhatan tribe. And without the aid of the Powhatan tribe, of whom Pocahontas was a member, it is likely that the Jamestown colony would have eventually fizzled out and died. That they don't has a lot to do with the relations between the Powhatan and the Jamestown colonists, and those relationships were not always positive or good, or peaceful for that matter. But tobacco also comes to be a significant salvation, if you will, for the Jamestown colony. And one of the things I really want to make mention of here is just how central tobacco was to the formation of not only the Jamestown economy and social structures, but the South as a whole. And here's why. Initially, labor was found in what we call indentured servants. These would be poor people who came from England who couldn't afford to pay for their trip to come over, so they would have a wealthy merchant who was going to come over to Jamestown and invest in tobacco plantations, and they were going to bring these indentured servants with them. And an indentured servant was one who simply gave a portion of their life, anywhere between 4 to 7 years, and they said, we'll work for you, and after 7 or so years, we'll go free, and we'll be able to have access to land. Well, over a period of time, indentured servants began to live longer, and they began to lay claim to territories. And this is going to raise some serious tensions in Jamestown. It's going to lead to some rebellions, particularly we think of Bacon's Rebellion. And long story short, what you're going to find is that tobacco planters who represented a small group a small population of the Jamestown population, they're going to come to dominate large tracts of land. But because they're making a lot of wealth on tobacco, and because the indentured servants are now causing them problems, many planters turn to a more permanent system of labor. And at the time in the 1600s, when you really begin to see this shift take place, and it happens around the 1650s, 1660s, the transatlantic slave trade has been going on. That is, slaves are being bought and sold in West Africa and brought to different parts of the country. African slave labor will come to dominate the Southern economy. And one of the things that's going to transpire, of course, is in the Americas, in what will become the United States, slave labor will take hold. And in order to justify and continue and propagate the use of West African slaves, racist theories had to develop and emerge as a result. And we're going to talk about some of these racist theories throughout this class and in subsequent lectures. But understand that much of the idea of racism, our current understandings of racism and slavery in the United States happens in Jamestown. And we'll get more into that. Your textbook talks about that as well. The other experience that we're predominantly going to focus in on is the New England experience in Massachusetts Bay, founded by the Puritans. The Puritans were a group of religious folks who were basically ostracized in England because they did not prescribe to the theology of the Church of England. And they experienced persecution, so they came to the Americas, and they created what their founder, John Winthrop, called a city upon a hill. And basically what they were trying to do was to create a colony based upon their perceptions of the Bible. And they thought that they would be like a shining light onto other colonies. In other words, they would be an example. In the way that Jesus told his disciples, "You shall be a shining light upon a hill for all to see," that was basically the idea of the Puritans. Now, they believed deeply in this idea of predetermination, that is predestination. God has already written your ticket, whether you go to heaven or hell, and there's no way that you can change that fate. It basically denies the presence of free will, and that idea goes to the core of Puritanism, and it actually creates a lot of tension and anxiety as you are habitually and continually looking for signs of whether or not you're one of God's elect and you're going to go to heaven, or whether or not you're one of God's damned and you're going to go to hell. But that idea of predetermination, and the Bible basically comes to dominate their entire social, economic livelihoods. In fact, there was no separation of church and state in New England. Some folks, like Roger Williams, for example, believed that the church and state should be separate. And that didn't sit very well with the Puritans. And in fact, Roger Williams will be cast out of New England, will be cast out of Massachusetts. Rhode Island will eventually be founded by Roger Williams as a result of his being basically cast aside. But we need to understand the Puritan mindset because it comes to dominate their entire views about life and society and gender roles and children and how people should live with one another. And in the end, one of the key events that takes place in Massachusetts history early on is the Salem witch trials. And one of the interesting things about the Salem witch trials is that it really gives you a window into a number of different issues going on in Puritan society. It allows you to explore religious convictions. It allows you to explore social tensions. It allows you to understand that there are political divisions going on in and among the people of Salem. There are also opportunities to explore some of the more violent uprisings between Native Americans and the colonists. And so the Salem witch trials is something that we are going to look at, and it gives us an opportunity to really explore some of these issues. And what the Salem witch trials is going to allow you to do is to act like a historian, because one of the main questions that historians love to answer is, why did something happen? And there is no easy answer to the Salem witch trials because the evidence doesn't point to one particular answer. It points to a whole plethora of answers. And so you really have to serve and act like a detective to try to figure out what is the most plausible and accurate response to the question, what caused the Salem witch trials? So we'll be looking at that as well. Now, one last thing I'll say before I end here is this, is that the colonial experience is oftentimes overlooked, and that's because there is no large-scale drama generally that goes on, right? There's no major battles, there's no, significantly grandiose figures. But there's a lot of small scale dramas. And really what historians today look to do is not to look at history from the top down, right? We want to look at history from the bottom up. How should historians look at history when we look at Joe Blow Plowboy? When we look at people that, for the most part, most people don't care about, right? What can we learn about people and their experiences from looking at the lives of everyday folks like you and me? And then how can we see how that affects our understanding of what's going on at the top with like the Metropole and, you know, larger decisions made by more key figures, whether they're political or religious or social figures, what have you. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing this week. So I want you to take some of what we've got here, apply it to your reading, apply it to the videos that we'll look at this week, and then see what you can make of all this. If you have more questions or what have you, let me know. I'm happy to elaborate or expand upon this. But for now, I think we'll leave it right at that, as I've already gone past 15 minutes. So I will leave you again. Go in peace, be warm and filled, may the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a great week, guys, and as always, enjoy the curriculum.